For those of you who don't know, Woking is my hometown. It's a town of 100,000 population, roughly in the middle of the Surrey Hills, although we spell it with an E over there, and probably not that well known, except in recent years for the work on climate change and sustainability. But of course, historically, it's very old. It goes back to pre-Norman times, pre-Doomsday books. So the churches are well over 1,000 years old and still running. So that's a good example of sustainability. It's also the birthplace of Henry VIII. Henry VII owned Woking Palace, and as a boy, Henry VIII lived in Woking. More recently, we're quite well known for, that's where the Spice Girls cut their first record. And for those that are into the jam, Paul Weller was a resident of Woking and started the group up there as well. Cities, and the talk is mainly about cities, but it also covers rural areas as well, because rural areas tend to exist around cities. And it's important to understand when you're looking at climate change, that where the problem actually is, because quite often people are focused on the wrong things. Cities emit something like 75% of the world's CO2 emissions. And of that, centralised power generation is the primary cause of climate change. In London, it's responsible for 75% of London's CO2 emissions. In Sydney, that's 80%. That's because of your higher predominance of air conditioning. So it's not your foreign flights or your standby light on your television thing, all important to be done, but it's important that if you're trying to tackle a problem, you have to go at the root cause of it. So I'm going to take you through a presentation that summarises a practical strategy. I call it practical because we've actually done it. Starting off at low carbon today, because we can do that, but the end game is to move to a wholly renewable energy society and as close to zero carbon as we can get. Well, first you need to understand your problem. I said that centralised power generation is responsible for 80% of Sydney's CO2 emissions, so why is that? Most people don't know about these things. The efficiency of power generators, and here I've shown an example, coal, which is a predominant form of energy generation in New South Wales, 36%. That means the other 64% is wasted, it's thrown away. Another 9 or 10% is lost in the grid. So by the time that the energy reaches your home, you've only got about a third of the primary energy that was burned at the power station. A little known fact, it uses an awful lot of water to get rid of that heat. For every hour that a 1,000 megawatt power station is operating, it'll generate 1 million kilowatt hours of electricity, 2 million kilowatt hours of heat, which it doesn't want, so it throws that away into the atmosphere through cooling towers, and it uses about 100 million litres of water per hour to do that. In the UK, it's more than 50% of the UK's water resources is used to throw heat away at power stations. In the US, it's about 53–54%. I don't know what Australia's figure is because that's secret. You can't find it anywhere on government web or anything like that. But it's probably more like America or maybe even worse. So the reason why you have power stations up in the Hunter Valley is not necessarily because the coal's there, but it's near the Hawkesbury River. And that's lost water resources, which is particularly important for countries that are facing severe water shortages. In the US, planning consent has been refused for new coal-fired power stations in places like Arizona and Nevada, purely on the water grounds. They just cannot afford the water. This is just an idiot's guide as to how the energy generation system works. Power stations, the grid, are generating at very high voltage. In Australia, it's about 500,000 volts that comes out into the main grid. So there's an awful lot of energy lost along the way before it actually gets down to your level where you're using 230 volts to watch your television or switch your lights on. If you have gas-fired heating, you'll have a gas-fired boiler, but one of the differences I've seen here in New South Wales to the UK is just how much electric heating you use as well as electric air conditioning. So those figures, if you've got electric heating or reverse cycle air conditioning, these figures are even worse. This is assuming that you're using a gas-fired boiler, which some of you may be if you're in cities, but if you're not in cities, it's just that your only choice is electricity, then you're well down in the dumps. However, if we can recover that heat, and laws of physics dictate that whenever you use a thermal generation system, you're going to get about 1 unit of electricity and 2 units of heat. If that was more local, decentralised as we call it, Then we have the opportunity to recover that heat and to use that to heat buildings, to provide hot water. And through a technology called heat-fired absorption cooling, we can convert hot water into chilled water for air conditioning and refrigeration, and we call that tri-generation. Wokin's not an island, as I said before. It's in the middle of Surrey, but the reason it's called an island is it's essentially disconnected itself from the grid. It gets all its generates and supplies and distributes all its own energy within the boundary. The green dots represent, by the time I'd left Woking, I'd put in something like 81 decentralised energy systems, a mixture of different technologies, also private wire networks. I'll come on to that in a moment. And essentially, in a period of 14 years, we've moved from no energy resource to something like 98%. It's still 2%, which is the last 2% that's always the most difficult to get rid of, but that's progressing. Woking is still carrying on, even though I've left there 6 years ago. How I was able to do that? Well, in order to understand the economics, is why green can be more economic than black or brown, is you actually have to understand how the electricity trading system works. Because it's so inefficient, this is how the price of your electricity is made up at home. You don't actually see this on your electricity bill. The brown bit at the bottom is electricity, about a third, and 2/3 is everything else. Transmission losses, distribution losses. In the UK, the regulator has calculated that to be worth $1 billion US dollars worth of electricity is lost every year just heating up the wires and transformer chambers. You as a customer have to pay for that. Transmission use of system charge, that's the fee that the transgrid charges for transporting electricity from the power station to the grid supply point. Still hasn't got anywhere near you yet, that's at 500,000 volts still for the grid supply point. Distribution use of system charge, that's the fee that the distribution companies like Energy Australia charge for transporting the electricity from the grid supply point to the end consumer. You then have a raft of government levies and taxes. In the UK, we have the climate change levy, renewable obligation. You have similar things over here as well. The supply margin I've got there, you would otherwise know that as the fully deregulated energy market. That tiny sliver is the only bit that's competitive, because you can't change a power station, you can't change the grid, and you can't change your distribution network, except in Woking.